Yeah. Okay. Well, good afternoon, folks. Today we are back on fourth or five in our looking at the apostles, who they were and what they were all about. So we're going to try to get through four today. Thankfully, these are ones that are not mentioned much. There is that possibility. So, just a reminder, we've finding ourselves the term apostle comes from Greek apo and so, which means literally one who is sent off. Apo is away or off or from, and solo is to send. So we have this as an ambassador, a diplomat, a messenger, but it's more than just because they have a mission and they're empowered to do that mission, where the word apostle comes from. And so we've talked about how there are 16 people labeled as apostles in the New Testament. Some of them are were there with Jesus' days, that they mentioned in Acts of the Apostles or in letters that are being sent to different folks. So today we end up looking at the last four that were mentioned in the Gospels, and then next week we'll talk about one in the Gospel and then two others that show up in Acts of the Apostles and Epistles. So today we are going to start off with Thomas, and when we end up looking at the word Thomas, it comes or is related to the Hebrew word Toma, which Toma in Hebrew, means twin. And in Hebrew, when we we also have John calling him Didymus, which in Greek means twin. So Thomas is a twin. Twin of who? What? No. So remember, John and James, sons of Zebedee. Thomas is not given any name of a brother or anything of that nature, but we do know that in all likelihood he was one of a pair of twins. Now, there have been speculation, which I don't buy at all, but some medieval scholars thought, well, he's a twin. And so he must be the opposite of Jesus, in that Jesus shows all this faith and care, and Thomas is the opposite because he's doubting Thomas. I don't buy it. It's just that he probably was a twin. His twin wasn't involved with other things. This is the guy we end up hearing about. So, when we end up looking at the New Testament, we see in the Synoptic Gospels that are all sort of together, the synopsis, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they end up just having his name in the list. Here were the 12 apostles that Jesus chose. Here's the list of the 12. Thomas was one of them. In John, however, we see a very different picture of him. He shows up in a number of spots. So when Jesus turns his face towards Jerusalem and tells them that, he is going to die, Thomas is sort of like, let's go so that we may die with you too. And know, the glory of all of that. And then a few more verses, a few more chapters, Jesus says, I'm going ahead to prepare a place for you. And, I'm going. And Thomas said, Lord, we do not know where you're going. And so he's given that kind of verbiage and discussion. So that do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places, and I have a place for you. Lord, Lord, we do not know where you're going. How can we know the way? And Jesus said, the way of life. So Thomas is used as sort of a foil for Jesus in a few spots. So we end up hearing about him in the Gospel of John, but then we have to get to the resurrection. So on Easter, in John 20, on the day of resurrection, Jesus ends up, being resurrected, and then he ends up showing himself to the folks there with the 12 all together in a room closed away, a house closed away, and Thomas, for some reason, isn't with them. And so they end up saying, "Hey, Thomas, we've seen Jesus. He's resurrected." And he's sort of like, "I don't buy it. I don't believe you." Yeah. So he says, "Unless I put my fingers in the nail holes and my hand in the side, I will not believe." And so we often get it as, well, he's a doubting Thomas. That not really clear about it, doesn't end up believing him. And we often see this as sort of a negative for him. One of the things I find helpful about this story, though, is that Thomas does have questions. He's not one that's going to end up just believing things willy-nilly. And he's also willing to stick around because the story resolves itself a week later. All the disciples, all the apostles are gathered together again, and Thomas is with them. He hasn't said, "Oh, you guys are fools, forget it, I'm going on my own." He's staying there with them. And then Jesus shows up and says, "Here I am. And here's the holes, and here's the piercing in the side." And Thomas's response is, "My Lord and my God." First affirmation that Jesus is God in that gospel. And so we end up seeing this guy who has this deeper insight. And when we think about it, the opposite of faith isn't doubt. Doubt and questions are part of the human existence. Jesus even had a little bit of doubt in the Garden of Gethsemane. Is there any other way to do this? I don't want to do this. The opposite of faith is actually fear. So doubt has its place. And Thomas gives us that kind of openness and ability because Jesus, in response to Thomas, blessed are those who have come to believe, even though they haven't seen. It's not that it's you just believe, it's come to believe. There's a process there. And so engaging in doubts and questions is absolutely part of faith. And as you're moving with those questions, you probably find it that suddenly the questions aren't as important when you finally get the answer, or at least the answer isn't important. The question is. And when that question gets answered, then you have another question or another 20 or whatever. I mean, I know that you've never experienced that where you have a question about something, you learn about it, and then you have another 10 or 15 questions that push in a different direction. So Thomas gets this bad rap, but he's really there as a good foil for what Jesus is doing and how he's trying to explain and help people understand. And so the gospel according to John uses him in these ways and gives him words and actions that don't show up anywhere else in the gospels. Now, we do have a lot of later traditions about Thomas. So Thomas is, there with the disciples. He shows some of this doubt, but then he also has other things attributed to him. So there's actually a Acts of Thomas and the Gospel according to Thomas. Those things are out there. People knew about them in the first and second centuries, but the church fathers ended up reading and saying, this is nothing. This is something that actually is an antithesis of Christianity, and it's heretical. So in the time of Jesus around the Mediterranean, there were a number of folks that had this belief that certain people got special knowledge, special ways of understanding and interpreting things. And only those special people were able to really get it and understand it. And this type of thinking was called Gnosticism. And so Gnosticism was something that was going around in many different faith traditions that said, hey, here's the secret. Here's how you understand it. Here's how you learn it. And only certain people are able to get it. Christianity had this in and among itself as well, that there are some folks that went to Gnosticism within Christianity, and what it ended up showing was that Jesus really was there to help people understand this secret. And the secret was there actually were two gods that made the world. The Old Testament God who ended up creating the stuff, and the God who is God of Jesus was the one that did the spirit. And so Jesus was really just spirit and is able to help us move beyond the world of matter and really just be fully spirit. And sort of like, okay, this gets really weird. And that's why Gnosticism was considered heretical, that it's not something that shows Jesus, because they would be affirming that Jesus was not there in the flesh. It was just a spiritual manifestation, that you really didn't understand it fully if you didn't know the secret. And so we had all of this stuff that was going on with the Gospel according to Thomas, the Acts of Thomas, that were really Gnostic writings that the early church said, no. So it was still attributed to Thomas, but it really wasn't. It wasn't understood. It wasn't appreciated or, believed in the wider church. There's also an infancy gospel of Thomas that tells about Jesus' birth. It brings in some of the things that we've seen from another proto-gospel that we talked about earlier. But it also ends up giving a story of Jesus as a boy, where he ends up having 12 clumps of clay and he shapes them into birds, and then they become real and fly off. And so there's some of those stories, people, of course, say, no, that wasn't there. He also there's the tradition that he was one who was sent on a mission to India, and that he ended up getting to India and actually founding churches. And so oftentimes when you're looking at images of Thomas, he might have a carpenter square because he was famous for building churches, figuratively, but there's also this idea that, well, maybe he also literally built them. With that, there were actually some small Christian communities in India when Europeans went there in the 13 and 1400s, that they were actually able to find these St. Thomas Christians. And so it's possible that he did make it there. It's possible it could have been someone else who was, working after Thomas that got the message there. But whatever it is, there's a tradition of him in India. There's also the speculation, folks early on in the 2nd and 3rd century said, well, he even made it to China. And then there's something else that says, when Paraguay is coming into being in South America after the Spanish conquest, that Thomas was actually there as a missionary as well. To which I say, not sure. There was no way for people to make that journey from Middle East to India to pay. So that's why you have me with 3 question marks there saying, really? Okay, again, tradition. Finally, there's also the tradition that he was killed with a spear being pierced into his side. So if you end up looking at paintings, you'll see a spear in the background. This one, I thought I saw a spear off to the side. But when we're looking at, he said, unless I see the holes in his hands and put my hand in the hole in his side, and here Thomas is killed by a spear to the side. So it's sort of this, tradition that, here it continues on with what, Thomas was sort of like, unless I do that. Well, you saw it, you experienced it, and now you get to experience it again. So what I've got about Thomas. What are your thoughts at your table? Think about the stories. Think about what is told by tradition. Think about what's told by, the scripture passages, the way that John uses him a little bit differently than the other gospels that just name him. Talk at your tables and say, so what is the importance of this? What does the story of Thomas help us understand in our lives of faith? And Carol, maybe you can switch to another table so that you don't have to just talk to yourself. I know that you'd be able to do it, no problem, but, an invitation to have conversation with other folks other than just you. Go ahead and talk at your tables and we'll end up, checking in a few more minutes. Yeah. So, folks, what were some things that you heard around your tables? Well, so, there's an plotting a death. Indeed, I appreciate that too, because it is something that I do quite a bit. Yeah. Why does society ask more questions? Didn't understand, so they don't look good, so ask questions or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's part of what John is trying to do in that story. It doesn't show up in any of the Gospels, but it ends up really bringing, the ability of those folks that have not seen Jesus come to that time of belief into the fold and saying, it's okay. Even folks that, did see him still had questions. And they ended up coming to the point, and the community didn't kick them out. I mean, that was another thing. The community, the other 10 at that point did not say to Thomas, well, since you don't believe what we believe, there's the door. Get out and don't let it hit you on the way out. I mean, they still kept him there as part of that community of faith. So, we end up having Thomas there. And the next one we're going to talk about now is Matthew. And so you remember how I said, well, it can be really hard to figure out who, one of the disciples is because they don't always get the same names or they aren't mentioned quite the same. Matthew is one of those. So we have Matthew, who's traditionally understood as the writer of the Gospel according to Matthew. And so in the Gospel according to Matthew, he's referred to as Matthew the publican, which means the person who's, doing taxes or other public documentation stuff. In Mark, however, we have Matthew listed as someone in the 12 apostles, but then there's a story of Levi, who's a tax collector, who Jesus invites to follow him, and he ends up following him and then has a dinner in his honor where collectors and sinners are coming by. So we have folks that are sort of like, okay, well, Matthew's in the list, but then here's Levi doing what Matthew does in the Gospel according to Matthew. And then John doesn't mention him at all, and Acts has him just mentioned in the list of the 11. Now, here's what's interesting. Mark, in the Gospel according to Mark, when he's talking about Levi the tax collector, who's responding to Jesus saying, come and follow me, he calls him Levi, son of Alphaeus. Now, if you remember your list of disciples, you have James, the son of Zebedee, and James, the son of Alphaeus. So, it could be that he is actually the brother of James the younger, or James the lesser, or James the son of Alphaeus. So it really gets complex here because we have different names associated with things that we think are the same story, and it doesn't get, understood more easily. So when we end up looking at the New Testament, we have this Matthew or Levi, depending on whether you're looking at Matthew, Mark, or Luke, was a tax collector. So let me read you what is there in the Gospel according to Mark. Jesus went out again in Mark 2, verse 13 through 15. Jesus went out again by the sea. The whole crowd gathered around him, and he taught them. As Jesus was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as Jesus sat at dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples. There were many who followed him. Okay, that's Mark. Remember, we use Mark usually as that gospel that people are working off of. So if we end up listening to Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 8, when the crowd saw it, they were filled with awe, and they glorified God who had given such authority to human beings. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as Jesus sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. Almost exactly the same words. So we're thinking that Matthew, the writer of Matthew, is picking up these words from Mark, but saying he got the name wrong. And Levi is actually Matthew, because supposedly Matthew wrote that. He would know. And then we end up going to Luke. And we're in chapter 5, verse 27. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi gave a great banquet for him at his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at the table with them. And then, of course, we get to the Pharisees, look at this and say, "Hey, he's eating with tax collectors and sinners. Do you know that he's doing this? Why are you letting him do this? This is dumb." And so we have these two actions of either Matthew or Levi, and so it gets a little bit complex, especially when there's that part about Jesus saying to Levi, "Follow me," and he gets up and follows. I mean, this is the same wording and language used for Peter, Andrew, James, and John in the Synoptics. So we have this weird thing where it's Matthew whose name is used in the list of the disciples in all three of the Gospels, but when it comes to this one story about the call of Matthew, in Mark and Luke, it's actually the call of Levi. So how do we resolve this? We end up saying Matthew had two names. Matthew was Matthew in Greek and Levi in Hebrew. Maybe. I guess. I mean, this is where things get really complex when we're looking at the apostles, because we don't have really big stories about them in the Gospels that help us understand what they're up to and what they're doing. and help flesh out who they are. And the differences in the Gospels end up making it more of a place that we can trip up. So, we also have a couple other things in the scriptures. So in Acts, Matthew is listed as one of the disciples, but he's just there in the list. No actions ever given. We do have the gospel attributed to Matthew. And so scholars say, well, it could have been written by Matthew, but in all likelihood, if we listen to other parts of the story, other older traditions, he died before the book of Matthew would have been written. So they would often end up saying, here's what happened. That Matthew told stories to a community of folks that really were following along after Matthew because he was sort of their teacher, leader, sort of like Paul in the Corinthians or Paul in the Thessalonians. Paul ended up staying in connection with them even after he'd gone on for a while. So it's probable that Matthew had a community there in, the region of Judea. And that he's writing to them, he's, telling these stories for them, and folks that are part of that community are remembering them and then saying, okay, we're going to write this down. So they end up using Mark's as a framework to put the other details and other stories that they have in there, and that's how we end up with the gospel according to Matthew. So it's probably not written by him in and of himself. But if we think about it as the gospel according to Matthew, it's according to the stories that Matthew told, according to the way he told those folks in the community. And folks have a suggestion that Matthew was really looking at a community that has strong Jewish roots. Because a lot of what Matthew does is tie into Jewish tradition and Jewish practices. He's the one that takes significant time to show the lineage of Jesus coming down from David. So that here is this, the shoot coming off of the tree of Jesse. So when we are looking at this, when we talk about the gospel according to Matthew, remember we want to talk about it as according to, not from or by. Because in all likelihood, he did not physically write that down. But some of the disciples that were with him ended up writing things down and then compiling it. And then, of course, the Gospel of John, nothing said about him. Now, there's also some later traditions. And so we end up having what I've already told you, that he probably preached to Jewish community in Judea. So we've talked about that with the people. Probably a mission to Ethiopia, went there to preach. But then there's also someone saying that, well, there's another way to think about this, that Ethiopia is actually something around the Black Sea, something different than Ethiopia in Africa. I don't know. It's a lot of speculation. But if you go with the possible mission to Ethiopia, one of the stories attributed to that time and place was that he, had time to talk with the daughter of the king, at least at that time, and convinced her about Christianity, so that she became a nun. And she was there at a worship service that he was leading, and after her father died, an uncle took the throne. And that uncle was there and thought her beautiful and wanted to marry her because he was lustfully looking at her. And Matthew, there doing the service, the worship service in that space, told the guy, "Stop it, you're being really crude. You should not be thinking about this because she's already married to Christ." And so the king's guard killed him right there, stabbed him with a sword. Boom, done. So, yeah, I'm not so sure that that became, story, but that's how it is. Additionally, there is another set of gospel writers that talks about that seems to be by Matthew, but early, church fathers knew that no, it wasn't. That, and they call it the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew because it's the false Matthew. It goes into a lot of the birth narratives as well, and pretty much anything that you have with the wacky birth and teenage years, church says forget it. We're not talking about that because we don't have accurate information. So there is that. I already talked about the Gospel of Matthew, that it was not written in current form by Matthew. So there easily could have been stories that were told and then someone else wrote it down. So, not a whole lot about Matthew other than this idea of whether he actually wrote that or wrote the gospel according to Matthew or not. So why don't you talk at your tables for a few minutes, thinking about what is the information that we got here that could be of use for you in your spiritual life. What do you learn about with Matthew that can help you in this time? Yeah. 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 So, what are some of the things you were talking about in your tables? Tell me a little bit about what the discussion was there. At the back table, tell us a little bit about what you were talking about. You guys, further back. Right. Whatever his name was, he was important enough to be remembered. Well, and remember that there's also a significant portion of the Gospels where Jesus is indeed reaching out to the tax collectors. So remember, tax collectors are those folks that are contracting with the Roman occupying force to take money away from their compatriots and end up lining their pockets along the way. So they're not popular at all because they're dealing with dirty money. They're making it easier for their overlords to get the money that they want, and they're taking it out on their own people. And so they're dirty, rotten scoundrels. And then on top of that, we have the sinners alongside them. And Jesus goes and invites them. And so they actually respond. And it's in this response that we get, the story of the prodigal son, the story of, the lost sheep, that Jesus is responding to Pharisees saying, you're not doing the righteous stuff. And he's saying, God wants everyone to come back. And if you're missing the point that you're a sinner as well, then you've got a problem that's probably bigger than these folks. So this whole idea of tax collectors really is really of importance. I should have emphasized that a little bit more. Okay? So let's go ahead and move on to James, the son of Alphaeus. Okay, this is one that's really difficult because you can really start screwing with your head. So, when you look at the name James in the New Testament, there's at least three distinct people, possibly more that we can identify. So, first of all, we have James, the son of Alphaeus, listed in the names of the 12 apostles. But then we have another spot where we have James, the son of Zebedee. So we know him because he always goes along with John, and they're the ones whose mother or they asked for a special spot, and the rest of the disciples got really ticked off at them. So we know who James, son of Zebedee is. But we have the son of Alphaeus, and then we also have in Matthew and Luke a passage where Jesus' mother, Mary, comes and wants to talk to him, and folks around that saying, hey, isn't that Jesus' mother along with his brothers James and Judas and something else? And something else. And so there's four men's names listed there as Jesus' brothers, Mary's sons. So there's also the speculation that Jesus had a brother named James. And then there's another place where Mary, not Mary the mother of Jesus, but Mary who's the mother of James and Joseph, shows up, at least at the foot of the cross. So we end up having all kinds of confusion about what's going on here. And just to remind you, Matthew has Levi, the son of Alphaeus, or Mark has Levi, the son of Alphaeus, there along with James, the son of Alphaeus. So there's possible brothership with Matthew. And here's where things get really kind of complicated. So James, the son of Alphaeus, is given no actual actions or words in any of the Gospels. No actions or words. There's all kinds of Jameses around. And so we have to look for this Saint Jerome. Jerome was a guy who was, trying to, do significant theology and translation of scriptures into languages people read around the Mediterranean. And so Jerome came around born around 345 CE, died in 420. And Jerome was someone who actually knew Greek and Hebrew and Latin. And he ended up doing the translation of the Bible into Latin. And all kinds of logical work going on there. And that is James, the son of Alphaeus, is the same as the apostle who's called James the Less, or the younger, or the older, is James, the brother of John. Of Jesus. So Jerome says James, the son of Alphaeus, is James the lesser, who's the apostles, and same as James the brother, or Jesus. So we're putting all these three Jameses together into Jerome. But then he also says that James's mother is Mary, but not Mary who is Jesus' mother. It's Mary, the wife of Cleopas, who is also would have been married to Cleopas, but married to Alphaeus, and Mary was there at the crucifixion. Second Mary. Are you confused? I'm totally confused about this because there's just not a clear understanding what's going on with him. There's nothing given for this James, son of Alphaeus, as action. There's nothing really, brought together about who he is. And so people start speculating and saying, well, I have a James here and James here and James here and James here. And I know this James is the brother of John. We'll make this James all those others. It's hard. It's nearly impossible to figure out what's going on with James and who he was connected to. And I think that the later gospel writers, or not gospel writers, the later, people who are trying to figure things out said, this guy's just too confusing, so we aren't going to even tell you where he died or what countries he went as missionary to, because it doesn't show that a whole lot. But we do know they died by being beaten to death with the Fuller's Club. So a fuller is someone who takes cloth and they get it wet and so that the fibers shrink and it is more waterproof off. And so, they beat it with a stick to get it to do that. Well, he was beaten to death with that. And so this is a picture of James being beaten to death with a stick. And if you look closely here, he's carrying because that's what death. So it just was really complicated with some of these disciples to stay meaningful because it's just such a muddle of it. I'm going to have that the next one too. There's not really much, so we'll this and together and say we get it. He's also with a very confused identity because he's called Thaddeus, and the King James Version of the Bible says is also called Lebbaeus. But if you look in the New Revised Standard Version or the Revised Standard Version or the New International Version, it's not in there. Because scholarship said this, this name of Lebbaeus is a later addition, that it wasn't always there. So the King James Version has it in there as he's Thaddeus or Lebbaeus in Matthew. He's also called Judas, son of James in Luke, and Judas, not Iscariot, in John, and then Judas, son of James, or brother of James, in Acts. So, in all likelihood, this guy's name is probably Judas. But because they didn't want to end up confusing folks between Judas Iscariot and Jude or Thaddeus, end up Jude. And is of Judas and Jude, their names. So end up this disciple called Jude with called either James. Does gospel. We also Jude. And in last month. He worked with Bartholomew. Visited around Judea, Lebanon, so Armenia. He died by axe with an axe. And so, anyway, matter of who it was from wasn't this apostle. The different would have been, and so is Thaddeus, or if we call him Jude, you may Jude, saint of that we have the hospital, St. Jude's Hospital, really rare or definitely fatal diseases for kids, that Danny Thomas founded, for his daughter in a way. So tradition, at least in the church, would be causes. As I was doing So are I mean goes around Catholic to help find the staff and faith in to get it faster. This is Jude things that and so those two were thinking with all and food. We really think up coming at you about life, your about how spiritual have to go. Talk at your tables for just a minute or two, and then we'll end up finishing up today. She doesn't. Mary Magdalene doesn't fit into this because she's not one of the apostles according to the list. Oh, she would have been there with all the apostles. There's no question. There were a number of women that were there all the time, helping out along the way. And what we see is that, she was sort of kind of like other woman in time. We don't know anything about that. So, okay, so what came up in tables regarding James, whichever one it was, and Thaddeus, just Jude. Some of the things. Mm-hmm. So we about them are important. I think that I'm fine. I'm not going to fall off. It's I mentioned and kept awake. There's also a part where it allows us. We too be delegate diplomat folks. to share what God is doing, even though our names will never end up in, even end up part of a list. Definitely won't record. Still having that, as there are fossils out there that don't know what they did, don't know how they died, don't know how they died. About us too, that we be those ambassadors that help share that. Folks don't remember the story in particular. It's important to know there's Peter that just about Peter. These other, there's little almost it all, and those two are there the bill for. Next week we'll do the, or not next week, but a couple weeks. Last Saturday, take on area, betrayal, and then by suicide. We're going to Ananias. He was the one that was elected or decided casting a lot, so using mace or something like that, to take Judas's place as apostles. And we'll also bring him because technology has think about, early says as apostle timely born. So he called himself an apostle. So because he did so much more than Matthias did, folks really start to think about Paul as really other than Matthias. Looking at what Paul is talking about, seeing how he is indeed one of the solos for and this idea and then dying suicide and so last format that we have for the last 4 sessions. So thank you so much, appreciate it, and we will be back together the first Thursday in December. Thanks for the folks that gave us a 966 in our